Imagine this. A man walks away from his wife and newborn baby because the cries of his little girl were too much for him. He left them with nothing. No money, no protection, no future. Most people would call that weakness. Some might even call it betrayal. But here's where it gets interesting, because when one man chose to run, another chose to stay. A rancher, quiet, steady, and feared by many, opened his doors. He didn't just offer shelter. He gave them his name, his strength, and the kind of love that speaks louder than words. Now, this story isn't just about survival. It's about what makes a man real, what makes a woman strong, and how a child's cry can test hearts in ways nothing else can. Some people will argue that blood is what makes a family. Others will say it's sacrifice. But after you hear this story, you may never look at loyalty, love, or even silence the same way again. So stay with me until the end, because this isn't a fairy tale. It's raw, it's gripping, and it just might change the way you see what true strength really is. Because here's the truth nobody wants to admit. Not every man who stands at the altar is built to stay when life gets hard. Some run at the first sound of responsibility. Some collapse under the weight of a baby's cry. And yet, in that silence of failure, another kind of man steps forward. The kind who doesn't need words to prove himself. The kind who doesn't boast, doesn't promise, he just acts. This rancher, he didn't care about what the neighbors whispered. He didn't care about what society said a man should or shouldn't do. He saw a mother on her knees, a baby girl in her arms, and instead of turning away like everyone else, he chose them. That's not weakness. That's not pity. That's power. And I want you to think about this as we move deeper into this story. What makes someone family? Is it blood? Or is it the moment you decide to stand for someone who has nobody else? The answer will shake you. And by the end, you'll see how one silent man proved more faithful than a husband, more protective than blood, and more lasting than words ever could. She never thought her life would collapse so quickly. One moment she was holding her newborn, praying her husband would come closer and share in the miracle. The next moment, he slammed the door and vanished into the night, leaving her with nothing but a crying child in her arms. He wasn't strong enough to handle the weight of fatherhood. He wasn't man enough to fight for his family. And here's where most stories would end, with a broken woman, a helpless baby, and no one to turn to. But not this one, because fate had a different plan. It sent her down a dusty road to a man everyone in town knew but no one truly understood. He was the silent rancher. People said he was cold, distant, even dangerous. But silence doesn't mean emptiness. Silence can mean strength. And when she came knocking at his door with her baby girl, he made a decision that shocked everyone. He didn't ask for her story. He didn't demand explanations. He didn't even speak much. He simply opened his home, and in time, gave them both his name. Now, you and I both know the world is full of talkers. People who promise the moon but vanish when life gets tough. But this story will show you why actions are louder than words, why loyalty outlives passion, and why sometimes the quietest man in the room carries the loudest kind of love. So as we go deeper into this tale, remember, you're not just listening to a story of heartbreak and hope. You're stepping into a lesson about strength, sacrifice, and what it really means to be a man. By the end of this video, you'll know why her tears turned into trust, why his silence spoke louder than vows, and why that baby girl grew up with the strongest name a father could ever give. The night she first arrived at his ranch, the baby wouldn't stop crying. Her tiny voice pierced the stillness of the prairie, a sound sharp enough to make even the toughest cowboy flinch. But not him. He didn't scowl. He didn't complain. He didn't walk away like her husband had. He simply stood there, calm and unshaken, as if the cries of a child were not a burden but a call, something he had been waiting for without even knowing it. The neighbors would whisper. They'd say, "Why would a man like him take in another man's wife and child? What's he hiding? What's he trying to prove?" But he never answered their questions. Because here's the truth. When a man knows who he is, he doesn't waste time explaining it to people who will never understand. And while tongues wagged and rumors spread, he worked. He worked the land by day, guarded that small house by night, and quietly stitched together a family out of nothing but pain, silence, and love. Now let me ask you this: what does it mean when a man with no obligation, no blood tie, no reason at all, still chooses to stay? That's not charity. That's not pity. That's the rawest kind of loyalty there is, and it forces us to ask, who really deserves to be called father? The man who leaves when life gets hard, or the man who stays, silently building a future with hands rough from work, but steady enough to hold a crying child? Stay with me, because this story is only getting started. We're about to see how strength isn't measured by words, but by actions that echo louder than promises. By the end, you'll know why some men disappear, and why the rare ones, like this silent rancher, become legends. The first weeks were the hardest. The young mother would sit by the fire at night, rocking her baby girl with tired arms, her eyes swollen from silent tears. She had lost her husband, her home, and the life she thought she'd built. All she had left was fear, and the sound of her daughter's cries. But every night the rancher was there. He didn't speak much, but he didn't need to. He brought in wood for the fire. He left food on the table. He fixed the loose boards on the windows. And when the baby cried through the night, he never once looked at her with frustration. He simply kept watch, quiet as the stars above the plains. You see, some people think love is shown through sweet words, promises, or grand gestures. But this story proves something different. Love is shown when a man keeps showing up, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs him something, even when no one is watching. One evening, she asked him, her voice trembling, "Why are you helping us? You owe me nothing." He just looked at her, eyes steady, and said nothing. But in that silence, she understood. His actions were his answer. He wasn't there out of pity. He wasn't there to win her favor. He was there because strength doesn't ask for reasons, it simply does what's right. And that's when she began to see the difference between the man who left and the man who stayed. One was all words, no weight. The other, he was silence with substance. Now pause and think about this. How many people in your own life talk endlessly about loyalty, about love, about commitment, but vanish when things get heavy? And how many stay without needing to say a word? That's the real test of character. And this rancher passed it without even trying. Weeks turned into months. The baby grew, and her cries softened into giggles. The house that once echoed with grief now carried the sound of life again. And slowly, without fanfare, without announcements, something unbreakable began to form. A family, built not by blood, but by choice. As the seasons turned, the young mother began to notice things she had never seen before. The rancher never raised his voice. He never boasted. He never complained about the weight of extra mouths to feed. Instead, he just worked. From dawn until dusk, his hands were calloused, his back bent, but his eyes steady. And in that steadiness, she felt something she hadn't known in a long time: safety. But safety wasn't free. Came at a cost. The whispers in town grew louder. Women at the mercantile would smirk when she walked in. Men spat in the dirt, muttering about a widow who wasn't really a widow. They judged her, they judged him, but neither of them wasted breath trying to explain. Why? Because people will always talk, and the strongest answer to gossip is silence and action. The rancher never defended himself. He never tried to correct the rumors, and that taught her something powerful. When you know the truth, you don't owe anyone an explanation. You just live it out. One cold night, the baby fell sick. Her tiny body burned with fever, her cries weak and desperate. Panic surged in the mother's chest. She paced, she wept, she prayed. And then, without a word, the rancher saddled his horse in the dead of night. He rode miles through snow and wind, returning hours later with the town doctor in tow. He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't wait for praise. He just stood watch at the doorway, his shadow long and silent, while the doctor worked to save the child's life. That night she realized something. Silence can be louder than declarations. A man's worth isn't proven by what he says in a moment of crisis, but by what he does. And when her baby's breathing steadied at last, she looked at him with tears in her eyes. Not of fear, not of grief, but of gratitude. Now let me ask you this, what kind of man risks his own safety, his own rest, his own peace, for a child that isn't even his by blood? That's not obligation. That's not duty. That's love in its rawest, most unshakable form. From that night on, something changed. She no longer saw him as just the silent rancher. She began to see him as the kind of man her daughter could one day proudly call father. Spring came, and with it new life on the ranch. Calves were born, fields turned green again, and the long winter seemed like a bad memory. But inside the mother's heart, the storm wasn't over. She carried questions that gnawed at her in the quiet moments. Was she a burden? Was she only tolerated because of pity? Would this silent man eventually grow tired of them the way her husband had? One evening, while the baby slept, she finally gathered the courage to ask. Her hands trembled as she set down the sewing she'd been mending. "Why do you keep us here?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "You could have sent us away long ago. You could have left us like he did." The rancher leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the fire. For a long time he said nothing. She thought maybe he hadn't heard her. But then, with that deep, steady calm of his, he finally spoke just 3 words. "You belong here." That was it. No speeches, no promises, no flowery words. Just the truth, simple and unshakable. And in that moment, she knew he wasn't keeping them out of pity. He had chosen them. Now pause with me and think about this. In life, people often use too many words to explain themselves. They say they'll be there. They say they'll stay. They say they'll never leave. But words are wind. What matters are the actions and the choices that back them up. This man didn't say much, but every nail he hammered, every mile he rode, every night he kept watch over that baby girl screamed louder than any vow. The baby grew stronger, crawling across the wooden floor, tugging at his boots, giggling at his horses. The first time she reached her little arms up to him, he froze. He had faced storms, wild cattle, even gunmen before, but nothing shook him like the weight of a child's trust. And when he bent down and lifted her, it was as though the silence between them all finally broke. Not with words, but with something greater. And here's the lesson buried in this story. Real fathers aren't always the ones who share your blood. Sometimes they're the ones who choose you, who fight for you, who claim you when no one else will. That little girl would grow up not remembering the man who left, but the man who stayed, the one who gave her his name, his strength, and his love without ever demanding anything in return. The ranch became more than just a shelter. It became a home. The young mother began to laugh again. Quietly at first, then fully, like someone remembering what joy felt like. She found herself baking bread, mending clothes, tending the garden, not because she was told to, but because for the first time in a long while she wanted to. She wanted to give back to the man who had given so much without asking. But life on the frontier was never without challenges. One afternoon, while hanging laundry, she noticed riders in the distance. 3 men, hard-faced, drifting toward the ranch. When they reached the fence line, their leader sneered. "Looks like the rancher's gone soft," he jeered. "Taking in strays now?" She froze, clutching her baby close. But before she could speak, the rancher stepped forward. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't shout. He just stood there, silent and unflinching. His presence alone enough to make even hardened men shift in their saddles. The leader's grin faltered. Silence can be heavier than bullets, and in that moment, they realized this was not a man to be tested. They turned and rode off, their mockery dying in the dust behind them. That night, as she rocked her daughter to sleep, the mother understood something new. Silence isn't weakness. It's power under control. The rancher could have fought, could have argued, could have exploded with rage. But he didn't need to. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands firm, unshaken. And that became a lesson not only for her, but for anyone willing to see it. When people attack, mock, or doubt you, you don't always need to defend yourself. Sometimes the best answer is to live in such a way that your life speaks louder than any insult. Seasons passed. The baby became a toddler, then a bright-eyed little girl, running through the fields, her laughter chasing away the ghosts of sorrow. She followed the rancher everywhere, into the barn, across the pasture, even trying to carry his tools, though they were far too heavy for her tiny hands. And though he never said it aloud, anyone who saw them together knew. She was his daughter, his blood in everything but name. And here's the truth no one in town could deny. The man who left had been forgotten. The man who stayed had become unforgettable. By the time summer came, the ranch had settled into a rhythm. The days began early, with roosters crowing and the smell of biscuits baking in the kitchen. The mother would hum softly while kneading dough, her daughter toddling at her feet, clutching a wooden spoon as if it were treasure. Outside, the rancher moved with quiet discipline. Mending fences, working cattle, keeping the land alive. They lived simply, but in that simplicity was something rare, peace. The kind of peace most people spend their whole lives chasing. And yet, in the back of her mind, the mother carried a quiet fear. What if this peace was too fragile? What if, one day, he too decided to leave? That fear was tested one hot afternoon when she returned from town with supplies. As she walked into the mercantile, she overheard two women whispering near the sugar barrels. She should be ashamed, living under his roof like that. Not even married, parading around with a baby that isn't his. And him? A fool for taking her in. Her cheeks burned, her chest tight. She wanted to scream, to fight back. But when she looked at them, she saw something clear in their eyes. Envy. They didn't hate her because she had nothing. They hated her because she had found what they hadn't. A man strong enough to stand without explanation. She returned to the ranch that evening, tears threatening to spill. But when she saw the rancher sitting on the porch, sharpening his tools while her little girl climbed into his lap, she realized something. The world could whisper all it wanted. Let them judge. Let them gossip. What mattered was the truth lived out in front of her. This was her family now. Later that night, while washing dishes, she asked him softly, "Do you ever care what they say about us?" He shook his head once, his voice low and steady. "They don't feed this family. They don't work this land. Their words mean nothing here." It struck her deeply. How many people waste years of their lives chasing the approval of others, bending under gossip, trying to prove themselves to people who will never be satisfied. But here was a man who knew the secret. The only approval that mattered was from the ones who shared your table, your roof, your life. The little girl grew fast. She no longer cried in the night. Instead, she filled the house with laughter. One morning, while tugging at his sleeve, she called him something for the very first time. "Papa!" The word startled him. His hand froze mid-motion. For a moment he seemed unsure, even shaken. But then, without a word, he picked her up, holding her against his chest. His silence said everything. From that day forward, the title was his, whether blood claimed it or not. And that's when the shift became permanent. He wasn't just the man who had taken them in. He wasn't just the protector or the provider or the shelter from a cruel world. He was father. He was family. And no one, not gossip, not whispers, not the memory of a man who had run, could take that away. Autumn came, painting the prairie in gold and fire. The rancher's life had always followed the rhythm of the land. Cattle drives, harvest, preparation for winter. But now, there was something new in that rhythm. The sound of a child's laughter and a woman's song drifting from the porch. It changed the air itself, turning a lonely ranch into a living home. But not everyone welcomed that change. One evening, as the sun dipped low, a rider appeared at the edge of the property. The mother froze when she saw him. It was her husband, the man who had walked away. His clothes were torn, his eyes restless, his face hardened by months of drifting. He dismounted, his voice sharp. "She's my wife. That's my daughter." The rancher stepped forward, silent as always, but unmovable. The husband's words cut the air like knives, but the truth hung heavier than his claim. This was the man who had abandoned them. This was the man who had run at the sound of his own child's cry. The mother's heart pounded. Fear warred with anger inside her. For a moment, the past threatened to pull her back into chains she thought she'd escaped. But then she looked at her little girl, clinging to the rancher's leg, and she found her voice. "No," she said firmly. You lost that right the night you walked away. The husband's face twisted, his pride stung. He turned to the rancher, spitting out. And you? You think silence makes you a man? You think she belongs to you? The rancher's eyes never flinched. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, his presence a wall that no weak man could scale. And in that silence, the truth was clear. Family isn't claimed by shouting. It's proven by staying. The husband left that night, cursing into the wind, but never returned. And though his shadow lingered for a while, the mother knew it no longer had power over her. She wasn't abandoned anymore. She wasn't broken. She wasn't alone. That night, as the fire crackled low, she whispered to the rancher, "Thank you for giving her your strength, for giving us your name." He said nothing, but the way he placed another log on the fire, steady and certain, told her all she needed to know. And here's the truth for you, listening now. Blood doesn't define family. Choice does. The man who walks away is forgotten. The man who stays becomes unforgettable. Winter swept in hard that year. Snow fell heavy, burying the land in white silence. Nights were long and bitter, the wind howling like wolves outside their cabin walls. But inside, warmth lived, not just from the fire but from the bond that had formed, a bond tested and proven. The mother often wondered how different her life might have been if she had stayed with the man who abandoned her. She imagined the loneliness, the hunger, the danger. Then she looked at her little girl, asleep in the rancher's arms by the fire, her tiny head resting against his chest, and she knew. What she had lost was nothing compared to what she had gained. But storms on the frontier weren't only made of snow. One day, a group of ranch hands from a neighboring spread rode over, trouble in their eyes. They claimed part of the rancher's land was theirs, that the boundaries were drawn wrong. Their leader sneered, glancing at the mother. A man living with another man's wife? Raising another man's brat? Maybe you don't deserve this land. The insult hung in the cold air. The mother's heart raced, but the rancher didn't flinch. He stood silent, his eyes locked on the men until the weight of his stare forced them to shift uncomfortably. Finally, in a low, steady voice, he said, "This land is mine, and so is this family. If you think otherwise, test it." There was no bluster, no raised voice, no drawn gun. Just a truth delivered with such calm certainty that the men turned their horses and rode away, muttering but unwilling to challenge him. That night, as she patched a tear in her daughter's dress, the mother realized something important. Silence can be misunderstood. Some think it's weakness. Some mistake it for indifference. But in the hands of a strong man, silence is a weapon sharper than any blade. It unsettles, it disarms, it commands respect without wasting breath. As the weeks passed, life continued. The little girl learned to speak in full sentences, her laughter filling every corner of the cabin. She would chase chickens, tumble in the snow, and always come running back to the rancher with muddy boots and bright eyes. Each time, he would scoop her up without hesitation, his rough hands surprisingly gentle. And slowly, the mother's heart healed. What began as fear and survival turned into something deeper: trust, gratitude, and the first fragile sparks of love. Not the fleeting, fiery love that fades with time, but a love built on quiet actions, on sacrifices never spoken aloud, on loyalty that needed no explanation. Now pause with me here. Think about your own life. How many people do you know who shout about their loyalty but vanish when storms come? And how many, like this rancher, don't say much but stay anyway? This story isn't just about them. It's about us. It's about learning to see who really stands when the winds blow hardest. Spring returned, melting the snow into rivers that carved through the land. Life on the ranch was hard, but it was theirs. The mother planted a garden. The little girl chased butterflies across the fields, and the rancher worked from dawn until the stars rose. Each season seemed to tighten the invisible thread binding them together. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. One afternoon, while driving cattle across the ridge, the rancher spotted smoke curling from the horizon. By the time he reached home, the barn was ablaze. Flames roared, the sky blackened, and the horses inside shrieked in terror. Without a word, he leapt from his saddle and charged into the fire. The mother screamed for him to stop, clutching her daughter to her chest. But he didn't, because that's who he was, a man who acted, not one who hesitated. Moments later, he emerged, dragging 2 terrified horses to safety. His clothes singed, his hands blistered. He collapsed to his knees, coughing but alive. That night, while tending his burns, the mother's tears fell freely. "Why would you risk your life like that?" she whispered. His answer was simple, quiet, the kind of truth only a man like him could carry. "Because it's ours. All of it. You, her, this land. Ours." That word, ours, burned deeper than the flames ever could. It wasn't just his ranch anymore. It wasn't just her burden. It was their life, built from ashes, bound by choice, sealed by sacrifice. The town noticed, too. Whispers changed. Where once there had been judgment, there was now respect. People began to call him what he had already become: husband, father, protector. Some still gossiped, of course, but it no longer mattered. The truth was too strong to be denied. Years passed, and the little girl grew. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in gold, she climbed onto the fence and asked, "Papa, were you always my papa?" The question silenced even the birds in the trees. The rancher stood there, hands rough from years of work, eyes soft with something words couldn't capture. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he lifted her gently, setting her on his shoulders, and said in his low, steady way, "I was the moment I heard you cry, and that's the truth of it. Family isn't who shares your blood. It's who answers when you call." Now think about that. How many children grow up abandoned, forgotten, dismissed, while others are saved, healed, and given a future by someone who chose them? Blood may start a life, but love, steady, silent, faithful love, is what sustains it. And that's why this story matters. Because it isn't just about a woman, a child, and a rancher. It's about the power of staying when others walk away. It's about choosing love over fear. It's about proving, through silence and action, what it really means to give someone your name. By the second year, the ranch felt alive in a way it hadn't in decades. The fences stood straighter, the barn, rebuilt after the fire, stood taller, and laughter carried farther across the fields. The little girl was growing quickly, chasing chickens, feeding calves, and following the rancher everywhere like his shadow. But life on the frontier always tested those who lived it. That summer, sickness swept through the town. Coughing fits, fevers, children struck down in their sleep. Fear spread faster than the illness itself. When a neighbor's boy grew sick, the townsfolk turned away, afraid to help. But not the rancher. He rode into town with supplies, hauled water, and stood at the bedside of the boy when no one else dared. The mother watched him from the doorway, her daughter's small hand clasped in hers. She realized then that his silence wasn't just strength, it was courage. He didn't waste time speaking about what needed to be done. He simply did it. When the boy recovered, his parents wept with gratitude. Whispers about the rancher began to change again. People spoke not of judgment, but of respect. Some still said he was strange, too quiet, too withdrawn. But even they could not deny he was the kind of man you could trust when everything else fell apart. One evening, as the mother stirred stew by the fire, she asked him quietly, "Why do you always risk yourself for others?" He looked at her, eyes reflecting the firelight, and said, "Because no one stood for me when I was small. I won't let that happen again." It was the most she had ever heard him say in one breath. And in those words, she glimpsed a past he never spoke of. A boy left alone. A young man hardened by silence. A heart that had learned to survive without anyone to lean on. And now, instead of bitterness, he used that pain to build protection for others. The little girl climbed into his lap that night, curling against his chest. "Tell me a story, Papa," she asked. He didn't speak, but he held her close, rocking gently until she fell asleep. The mother realized then that his silence itself was the story. A story of a man who stayed, who fought, who loved without needing to declare it. Seasons kept turning. The girl grew taller, her voice bright, her laughter carrying across the fields. She called him Papa without hesitation, never once remembering the man who had left. For her, there was only one father, the one who carried her on his shoulders, taught her how to ride, and worked his hands raw to give her a future. And here's what the story teaches us. Sometimes the strongest love isn't the one that comes with fireworks, speeches, or promises. Sometimes it's the love that shows up every day, quietly, steadily, until one day you realize it has built a life that no storm can tear down. By the time the girl turned 10, the ranch was no longer just a place to survive. It was a place where she thrived. She had freckles from long days in the sun, scratches on her legs from climbing fences, and a laugh that carried all the way to the river. The rancher, still quiet, still steady, watched her with a pride he never spoke aloud. Every morning she raced him to the barn. Every evening she sat beside him at the porch steps, legs swinging, waiting for the stars to appear. She didn't notice that other children had fathers who were loud, who told stories, who boasted of their work. To her, there was no comparison. Silence to her was comfort. Silence meant safety. Silence meant love. The mother, watching all this, often felt a tear slip down her cheek. She remembered the night she had stood alone, abandoned, a baby in her arms, feeling the world had ended. Now that baby was strong and smiling, and the man who had stepped in without a word had given her daughter a gift no one else could, stability. But not all the townsfolk forgot the past. Some still whispered behind closed doors, "That child isn't really his." Others smirked, "He's raising another man's bloodline." The mother heard those words more than once. Each time her heart ached. But when she looked at the rancher, bent over in the fields or walking hand in hand with the little girl, she knew the truth. Blood might tie a child to someone, but love claimed them forever. One evening, as the sun melted behind the hills, the girl asked the question that had lingered in the mother's mind for years. "Papa," she said softly, "why don't you talk much?" The rancher paused, his calloused hand resting on her shoulder. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he led her to the corral, lifted her onto her pony, and walked beside her as she rode under the fading light. That was his answer. He didn't need to explain who he was. He simply showed it every single day. The girl never asked again. She didn't need to. She understood him in ways even grown men couldn't. Time rolled on. She became a young woman, graceful yet strong, carrying the quiet resilience of the man who raised her. Suitors began to visit the ranch, tipping their hats, hoping for her hand. But the rancher watched them with that same steady silence, his eyes sharp, measuring whether any of them were worthy of her heart. Most were not. Some left quickly, uncomfortable under his wordless gaze. Others tried to impress him with talk, boasting of land, cattle, or money. He simply listened, never revealing approval or rejection. But the girl knew her father didn't care about wealth or words. He cared about character, about whether the man who came calling would love her with the same steady devotion he had given all his life. And here's the lesson. The people we surround ourselves with reveal what we truly value. The rancher had built his life on loyalty, on action over talk, on silence that carried more weight than promises. And because of that, his daughter learned to expect the same from anyone who wanted a place in her life. Years passed, and eventually one man proved himself. Not through grand gestures, but through quiet consistency. He worked alongside the rancher without complaint, protected the girl without smothering her, and showed up day after day, rain or shine. The rancher didn't need to speak approval. The day he handed the young man his best horse, everyone knew. It was his blessing. On the girl's wedding day, as she stood in white, holding her bouquet, she clutched the rancher's arm. Tears brimmed in her eyes as she whispered, "Papa, thank you for giving me your name. Thank you for giving me everything." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was full, overflowing with pride, with love, with the unspoken vow he had kept since the night he first took them in, that no matter what, he would never leave. And that vow shaped not just one life, but generations to come. The seasons kept rolling over the land, each year carving more lines into the rancher's weathered face, each winter frosting his hair with a little more gray. The ranch stayed strong, the family grew, and the little girl, no longer little, now carried her own children on her hip. They called him Grandpa. To them, there was no question, no confusion about bloodlines or history. He was the man who lifted them onto saddles, who built them swings from old rope, who carried them high on his shoulders so they could see the farthest horizon. His silence, once misunderstood, became a treasure to the grandchildren. When they sat on his lap, listening to the crackle of the fire, they didn't need his words. They only needed his presence. The mother, now older too, would sometimes watch him from across the room. She saw the lines of time etched in his hands, the quiet dignity in his posture, the way his eyes softened whenever the children were near. She thought of the man who had left her, years ago, and realized something powerful. She had not been abandoned. She had been redirected. What she thought was an ending had only been the doorway to something greater. And the townsfolk? Their whispers faded over the years. In the end, the silent rancher's actions told the only story that mattered. He had built a reputation stronger than any rumor, forged not from loud declarations, but from decades of unshakable loyalty. When he walked through town, people tipped their hats. When he passed by, men stood straighter. Even those who once mocked him now admitted, there was not a more respected man in the valley. But time spares no one. One winter, after a long day mending fences in the biting cold, the rancher grew ill. He never complained, never spoke of pain. He simply kept going until his body could carry him no further. The family gathered around his bedside. The daughter groaned, the grandchildren hushed, the mother holding his hand as though she could keep him tethered forever. In those final moments, the little girl who had once been abandoned, now a woman, leaned close and whispered, "You gave me everything, Papa. You gave me a life. You gave me your name. And because of you, I'll never feel lost." For the first time in a long while, the rancher spoke more than a few words. His voice was faint but steady. "I stayed," he said simply. And with that, he closed his eyes, his silence now eternal, but not empty. It was full. Full of love, full of sacrifice, full of a life lived with quiet greatness. After his passing, the ranch stood as his monument. His children and grandchildren carried his values in their hearts, loyalty, strength, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest power lies not in what you say, but in what you do. The man who once had no family ended up creating one so large, so strong, that his legacy could not be erased. And that's the truth the story leaves us with. Words fade, promises can break, but actions, steady, consistent, silent actions, can echo across generations. Years passed after his death, but the ranch never lost the weight of his presence. His boots still sat by the door. His hat still hung by the wall. The rocking chair on the porch creaked in the evening breeze, as though waiting for him to sit once more. And though he was gone, his silence still spoke. The daughter, now a mother of 3, often found herself repeating his ways without even realizing it. When storms rattled the windows and fear gripped her children, she didn't drown them in promises she couldn't control. Instead, she sat beside them, steady, calm, her presence alone assuring them everything would be all right, just like he had done. Her husband, too, carried the rancher's influence. He had been a young man once, nervous and unsure, trying to win the hand of a quiet rancher's daughter. Now, decades later, he led his family not with loudness, but with constancy. He showed up every day, worked the land with his sons, and loved his wife without needing to announce it. He had learned that lesson straight from the man who raised her. And the grandchildren, oh, they told stories of their grandfather as if he were still there. Around campfires, they spoke of the silent man who had built everything they now enjoyed. They didn't talk about his words, they didn't need to. They remembered how he carried them when they were tired, how he worked until the sun dropped, how he never once left when things grew hard. His silence became their standard. Generations later, people still spoke of him in town. They said, "That ranch stands because of him." They said, "He wasn't a man of many words, but he was a man of truth." And though the names of talkers and boasters faded from memory, the name of the silent rancher lived on, passed from father to son, from mother to daughter, like a treasured heirloom. And here's the beauty of it. The girl who once cried in the arms of an abandoned mother grew into a matriarch, surrounded by love, safety, and legacy. Her father's choice to stay, to give her his name, to protect without speaking, changed not just her life, but the lives of countless descendants who would never even meet him. Because that's the way true legacy works. It doesn't come from speeches carved in stone. It comes from the choices we make when no one is watching. From staying when it would be easier to walk away. From standing firm when others crumble. From loving not with words alone, but with action that endures. The rancher may have been silent, but his silence was never empty. It was filled with strength, filled with faithfulness, filled with the kind of love this world doesn't see often enough. And so, even now, when the wind moves across those open plains and brushes past the wooden fences he built with his hands, it seems to carry a whisper. A reminder that sometimes the greatest men are not the ones who say the most, but the ones who stay the longest. Decades rolled into one another. The old wooden barn was replaced, the fences mended and rebuilt. The house expanded to hold more children, more laughter. But through every change, one thing never shifted, the story of the man who had built it all. The grandchildren grew into adults, each carrying a piece of him in their hearts. One grandson became a teacher in town. When asked why he never gave up on struggling students, he'd say, "Because my grandpa never gave up on me." Another became a rancher himself. He didn't speak much either, but when neighbors saw how faithfully he cared for his land and his people, they nodded knowingly, just like his grandfather. Even the granddaughter who moved to the city carried him with her. When life grew loud and chaotic, she remembered the evenings on that quiet porch, the sound of the rocking chair creaking, the silence that had always been enough. She often told her own children, "Not every answer comes in words. Sometimes the answer is simply being there." And as time stretched on, the great-grandchildren heard his story so often it became part of their blood. They knew the tale by heart, how a mother had been left alone, how a baby girl had cried, and how one silent man had stepped forward, not with promises, but with presence. They never met him, but they felt they had. His photograph, worn at the edges, sat in the family home. Children would point to it and say, "That's the man who gave us his name." Even the land itself carried his imprint. The posts he drove into the ground still held firm. The ditches he dug still guided the water. The trails he wore into the earth became paths his descendants walked, as if to remind them that every step they took was because of the steps he had taken before. And so, the ranch became more than a piece of property. It became a living memory, a sanctuary of values passed down like inheritance. Loyalty, resilience, faithfulness, and the quiet strength of showing up. Generations who never heard his voice still heard his silence echo in their lives. This is where the lesson deepens. The silent rancher teaches us something most people miss. Legacy isn't about what you say. Legacy is about what you leave. Not money, not titles, not applause, but a way of living that endures through children, grandchildren, and beyond. The girl who once cried now told her great-grandchildren, "I was never abandoned. I was chosen." And that truth became the family's anthem, a song carried forward on the wind. And even 100 years later, when strangers passed through the valley and asked, "Who built this place? Who started all this?" the answer was always the same. Not a talker, not a boaster, not the man who left, but the man who stayed.